Before proceeding, viewers are advised to exercise caution. The following is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim reproduction of testimony in federal court in the case of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. The courtroom was filled with the usual silence and tension. Everyone present, judges, lawyers, journalists, and spectators, was expecting the usual speeches, the standard rhetoric that typically takes place in such venues. No one expected that at that moment something would change dramatically. At that very moment, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked through the door, a man known to all as a strong, confident hero from the big screen and the wrestling ring. He usually looked tough and fearless, but today he was completely different. His face betrayed anxiety, fear, and vulnerability, feelings rarely seen in a man like him. Everyone understood that he wasn't there to attract attention or promote himself. His appearance meant something much more serious. He was about to confess to the difficult and terrible things that had happened to him many years ago, when he was just starting to build his career in Hollywood. It was something personal and very painful, and you could feel it in every glance and every movement of The Rock. The atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. Everyone felt that something important and possibly unexpected was about to happen. Dwayne began to recount in detail how it all started with his meeting with Diddy. At first, it seemed like a real opportunity, Sue. Diddy helped him get into the most important parties that opened doors to the industry's inner circles. He introduced Dwayne to influential and successful people who could help advance his career. For a young actor just starting out in Hollywood, it seemed like a golden ticket, the chance every newcomer dreams of. Everything was going well, everything seemed normal and even promising. But over time, these meetings began to change. What used to look like ordinary hangouts with people from show business gradually turned into something completely different. The atmosphere around him became strange and tense, and Dwayne felt that something was wrong. He began to notice that these events were no longer just an opportunity to socialize and make useful connections. More and more, he felt that these weren't just parties. They were tests, trials, tests of loyalty, of willingness to obey and accept the rules of the game dictated by Diddy and his entourage. The people around him seemed to be watching his every move, assessing how willing he was to play by their rules. With each new appearance at these gatherings, the pressure grew stronger. A feeling of fear and anxiety grew inside Dwayne. He understood that much more than just his career success depended on his behavior. These meetings became a real test of his moral and personal boundaries. And all this was happening in the shadow of glitz and glamour that hid real cruelty and control. The most shocking and difficult moment in Dwayne's story was the description of the ritual he was forced to undergo. He was forced to eat raw monkey brains. Everything took place in a strange, almost surreal setting. He found himself in a small room where everything was bathed in red light. This light created a heavy and disturbing atmosphere, as if the very air around him was constricted by tension and fear. His eyes were tightly bound, and he could not see anything. The complete darkness and uncertainty added to his feelings of loneliness and vulnerability. People stood around him, silent, motionless, dressed in strict black suits, like guards or participants in some secret ritual. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their intense attention and silent approval or disapproval. He was offered this gruesome food, raw monkey brains, as part of the test. It wasn't just a strange or unpleasant act, but a kind of test. A test of loyalty, courage, and willingness to obey without question. Dwayne understood that refusal would mean something much worse, possibly exclusion from the circle, loss of opportunity, the end of his career, and even a threat to his personal safety. At that moment, Dwayne felt fear mixed with a sense of complete helplessness. He was scared and ashamed at the same time because he found himself in a position where he had to do something unnatural to preserve his dream. He felt alone, abandoned to his fate, as if everyone around him had turned away, leaving him alone with this terrible ordeal. When the ritual was over, something inside Dwayne broke. He said he felt as if a part of him had died at that moment. It wasn't just a physical reaction to what he had eaten. It was much deeper than that. A deep inner wound from agreeing to go through it, from giving into pressure and compromising his own principles in order to stay in the game, to continue fighting for his place in the world of show business. This experience left an indelible mark on his soul, changed him forever, and made him look differently at himself and what success in this industry is worth. But that wasn't the end of the story. After such harsh trials, a real psychological game began. People were made to believe that their fate was entirely in the hands of those in control, that success in Hollywood was not a result of talent or hard work, but a matter of complete submission and obedience. Dwayne recounted how he and other artists were locked in small rooms with no windows, where there was no light and no way to see what was happening outside. They were deprived of phones and any means of communication with the outside world, as if trying to cut them off from all support and sustenance. There, in these close spaces, they were forced to repeat strange phrases and statements designed to reinforce control over their minds. In addition, they were strictly forbidden to tell anyone about what was happening. Keeping their mouths shut became a mandatory rule. The whole system was designed for one thing: to break their inner will and force them to obey without question. Gradually, step by step, they were transformed from free people into submissive executors of someone else's will. And Dwayne felt this psychological trap slowly but surely closing in on him and his colleagues, leaving them no chance of resistance. After Dwayne went through all these harsh rituals and trials, he did indeed begin to receive offers of work and roles that had previously seemed unattainable. But it soon became clear that these offers weren't just a gift from fate. They came with very strict and unconditional conditions. To have a chance at success, Dwayne had to play by the rules set by Diddy and his entourage, and most importantly, keep quiet about everything that happened behind closed doors. Every time Dwayne tried to show even the slightest sign of independence, asking questions, expressing doubts, or even simply disagreeing, his chances vanished. Invitations to shoot and participate in projects simply disappeared, as if someone had pressed the stop button on his career. Roles that seemed almost his suddenly went to other actors, and doors that had previously been opened slammed shut with a bang. Gradually, Dwayne realized that Diddy was much more than just a producer or an influential person in the industry. He wielded enormous power that allowed him not only to give people opportunities, but also to take them away in an instant. This man could decide the fate of artists, raising them to the heights of fame or blacklisting them, an invisible but deadly barrier beyond which there is no career, no work, and virtually no future. The realization of this cruel reality shook Dwayne to his core. He understood that the entire system he found himself in was built on unconditional obedience and the fear of losing everything. In this world, talent and hard work were not valued. Only complete loyalty and silence mattered. This realization made him feel how deeply he was caught up in a game where the stakes were not just success, but his freedom and personal dignity. Dwayne's story shocked everyone in the courtroom. It reveals not only his personal suffering and inner struggle, but also sheds light on the dark side of Hollywood that is not usually talked about openly. His words show that success in this industry often requires enormous sacrifices, not only creative, but also human. To achieve recognition and fame, you have to submit, accept injustice, and keep quiet about what goes on behind the scenes. This story makes everyone think about how far people will go to maintain control and power over others. Power here does not simply influence careers. It controls destinies, breaks personalities, and suppresses any attempts at resistance. And the price paid by those who want to succeed is much higher than it seems at first glance. This is not just the story of one person. It is a mirror that reflects the harsh reality of an entire industry. Dwayne Johnson also said that he was always surrounded by managers, lawyers, and other people who knew very well that there were clear and unbreakable boundaries that could not be crossed under any circumstances. The name Diddy was hardly ever spoken aloud, unless it was in the form of praise or to emphasize his influence. This silence and caution created a special atmosphere, an atmosphere of fear and submission. In this atmosphere, Dwayne began to feel more and more like a puppet, controlled by forces he barely understood. Control over him and other artists came not only from the studios and visible people in the industry, but also from hidden, invisible groups that ran everything from behind the scenes. These groups kept the situation in their hands, using fear, secret services, and mutual debts like invisible nets from which it was almost impossible to escape. There was nothing open or honest here. The entire system operated through whispers behind people's backs, through subtle, barely perceptible agreements and hints. People were afraid to speak openly about what was happening because they knew that any word said in the wrong tone could cost them their career, their reputation, or even their safety. This secret power made the entire industry a complex and dangerous game, where the glitz and glamour hit a cold, uncompromising reality. One day, Dwayne found himself at an unusual event, which was initially presented as a film screening with an opportunity to meet and mingle with people from the industry. But from the very beginning, it was clear that this was no ordinary party. The house where the event was taking place was poorly lit, with shadows gathering in the corners, creating a gloomy and tense atmosphere. At the entrance, stern security guards carefully checked guests and did not let anyone in who was not invited. Everyone's phones were taken at the entrance. No one could record anything or make a call. Then everyone was given masks, not for fun or games, but to preserve the anonymity of the participants and hide their faces. It was more like an initiation ritual than a social event. The atmosphere was heavy and oppressive, as if everyone present was part of some closed and secret group that you couldn't just walk in and out of. Instead of the usual noise and fun, there was a tense silence, and it seemed that everyone was there not for pleasure but to pass a test, to prove their loyalty and devotion. This was a place where not only the body was controlled, but also the spirit, and every action was carefully observed and evaluated. All around the perimeter of this strange house, Dwayne felt a growing sense of discomfort and anxiety. It seemed to him that with every step he took, the atmosphere became heavier and darker. He looked around, noticing people he knew, famous actors, musicians, directors who had once commanded his respect and admiration. But now these people looked completely different. Their faces seemed lifeless, as if the fire that had once burned brightly inside them had been extinguished. Their eyes were empty, and their movements were timid and uncertain, as if they were hiding some terrible secret or carrying a heavy burden that they could not share with anyone. Some of them looked as if they were trying to prove their obedience and loyalty to the invisible masters of this secret game. They whispered to each other, quickly exchanged glances, and cautiously watched every step of those around them. The scene was more reminiscent of a sect or a closed community where everyone was afraid of being excluded and punished. One moment in particular shook Dwayne. In one of the dark corridors, he noticed a young actor who had already made a name for himself but now looked completely broken. The man stood with a glass clenched in his hand, crying quietly, trying to hide his emotions. His shoulders trembled with suppressed grief and exhaustion. When Dwayne cautiously approached him to find out what had happened, he whispered words that sounded like a sentence. "I was told it was necessary." These words were a revelation to Dwayne, revealing the full weight of what was happening. It was an admission that all these trials and humiliations were not accidental, not temporary hardships for the sake of fame, but a deliberate system that forced people to sacrifice their freedom, dignity, and even their mental health to keep their place in the industry. This moment deeply affected Dwayne, making him realize how cruel and inhumane the price of success can be in a world where power is held not by talent and merit, but by fear and control. After that evening, Dwayne went home much earlier than usual. He couldn't sleep for a long time. His thoughts wouldn't let him rest. The realization that all the glamour and glitz of Hollywood was just a facade swirled around in his head. Beneath this beautiful outer layer lay a complex and harsh system of control built on fear, manipulation, and endless pressure. He realized that he had been invited there not because anyone liked him or wanted him there, but because he was convenient. He knew how to keep his mouth shut and do what he was told. This thought was difficult to bear, but at the same time, it opened his eyes to the real mechanisms of power in the industry. When Dwayne remembered the suffering of that young actor crying in the hallway, he was overcome with emotion. He remembered himself as he used to be, free, confident, without fear or shame. At that moment, he decided that if anyone ever asked him what he had seen and gone through, he would no longer remain silent and lie. He would tell the truth, no matter how difficult it was. This decision was an important step for him, a step toward freedom and honesty with himself and others. In the courtroom, when Dwayne gave his testimony, a tense silence fell. Everyone present was listening not just to a famous actor and star, but to a man who had finally decided to tell the truth without hiding behind smiles and politically correct phrases. His words sounded sincere and heavy because he was not telling a made-up story, but recounting what he had experienced and seen with his own eyes. Dwayne explained why so many people in the industry prefer to remain silent. It was not because they lacked words or felt guilty, but because of fear of losing everything they had achieved, fear of being expelled and forgotten in this cruel system. He described in detail how those who dared to speak out or ask uncomfortable questions simply disappeared from the world of show business. Roles stopped coming in, phone calls suddenly stopped, and contracts that seemed to be signed were suddenly terminated without explanation. These stories made the audience realize how powerful and dangerous this invisible mechanism of control is, which keeps artists in constant fear and submission. It was an acknowledgement that behind the glitz and glamour lies a reality where success is measured not by talent, but by a willingness to remain silent and obey. Dwayne spoke honestly and in detail about how he had remained silent for many years for one simple reason. The price he thought he would have to pay for the truth was too high. He was afraid of losing everything he had built with his career and his name. The respect of his colleagues, the opportunity to work on major projects, financial stability, and, most importantly, his sense of security. At the time, silence seemed like the only way to protect himself and his loved ones from the devastating consequences. However, as he learned more stories from other people who had been affected by this system, and saw how those who remained under the control of these hidden mechanisms continued to suffer, Dwayne began to rethink his silence. It ceased to be a protection and became a heavy burden, a betrayal. A betrayal of himself, his values, and those who still cannot or are afraid to speak out against injustice. He remembered the words of a young fan who saw him not just as a celebrity, but as someone who never gives up, who always stands up for truth and justice. These words touched Dwayne deeply because he realized that he had long since ceased to be the person others saw him as. He had betrayed his younger self, the person who was free, strong, and believed in his principles, unafraid to fight for them. This realization caused an internal crisis in Dwayne. He understood that by remaining silent, he had unwittingly become part of a system that destroys the lives and freedom of many talented and strong people. He realized that his silence was not just a personal choice, but an act that supported this cruel and unjust game. This realization was a turning point for Dwayne. He realized that true strength does not lie in submitting and turning a blind eye to evil, but in speaking the truth despite fear and possible consequences. It was this inner decision that led him to court, where he spoke the whole truth publicly for the first time, openly and without fear, despite the possible risks and threats. It was a step toward liberation, not only for himself, but for all those who were still trapped in this system. At the end of his speech, Dwayne looked directly at Diddy and began to speak in a calm, even voice without shouting or excessive drama, but his every word sounded weighty and heartfelt. He said that he had carried this burden for too long, the heavy silence, the fear, and the feeling of loneliness. He admitted that for a long time he believed that success in Hollywood required sacrifice. Giving up your freedom, obeying unknown rules, and keeping quiet. To him, it seemed like the inevitable price to pay for the opportunity to move forward, for the chance to fulfill himself and achieve recognition. However, now, looking back and having gone through all these trials, he realized that this idea was wrong. What seemed like power and strength was actually fear disguised as cruel control. It was the fear of losing everything he had built, the fear of being rejected and forgotten. It was this fear that made people obey, remain silent, and accept humiliation. Dwayne made it clear that he no longer intended to live by these rules. He no longer wanted to hide the truth, be afraid, or hide. His words were a call for honesty and courage, both for himself and for everyone else in a similar situation. This moment was the culmination of his confession, showing that he was ready to fight for justice and freedom even if it cost him dearly. Dwayne spoke not only about himself, but also about those who still remain in the shadows, those who suffer in silence, hiding their experiences and pain. He thought about those who were afraid to speak the truth because it seemed like they had no other choice, that they couldn't fight the system. For many, silence became the only way to survive, but according to Dwayne, this silence turned into chains that held people captive, robbing them of their freedom and hope. He clearly stated that now all of this must end. It was time to speak openly about the truth, about the cruelty, manipulation, fears, and invisible forces that had long kept the industry in check. Dwayne emphasized that his words were not just an admission or a complaint, but a call for change, so that no one would ever feel alone and defenseless again. When he left the courtroom, he was a completely different person. Not a movie or TV star, not a victim of circumstances, but a man who had finally reclaimed his story. He was no longer afraid or silent, no longer hiding behind masks and compromises. His actions symbolized the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one based on honesty, courage, and a desire to fight for justice not only for himself, but for all those who remain in the shadows. This moment was one of liberation and hope for change. Before leaving the courtroom, Dwayne added a few words that sounded like an important and profound message. He said that his story is not a story of fame, success, or Hollywood glamour. In fact, it is a story about those people who will never be able to sit in that chair and openly tell the truth. People whose voices are silenced by fear, threats, and pressure from the system. These words served as a reminder to all of Hollywood, a huge industry that has built its empire on lies, silence, and fear for many years. But now this myth, this illusion of power and control is beginning to crumble. And this is not happening because of anger, revenge, or a desire to punish anyone, but solely because of the truth, a force that cannot be hidden or destroyed. It is the truth, he said, that can destroy established mechanisms and give a chance for change. His words hung in the air, filling the room with a heavy silence. Everyone present felt that this moment was not just another speech, but a turning point. The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound, but a symbol that the fear that had long held people hostage was finally beginning to fade. It seemed to say to everyone, "Now you can speak, now you can listen." No one in the hall dared to interrupt or shout him down. Everyone understood that they were in the presence of a man who had risked going against the system and telling the truth that many had tried to hide. Dwayne stood up calmly, without haste or looking back, and headed for the exit. His steps were confident, and they conveyed the freedom he had long sought. No one tried to stop him, no one interfered, no one tried to change his story or silence him. It was the moment when the power of a system built on fear, control, and silence failed for the first time. The system that had held many people in its grip for years suddenly lost its influence over Dwayne. His exit from the courtroom was not just the end of his speech, but a symbol of the beginning of a new era. An era in which truth and courage are more important than fear and lies. This moment gave hope to all those who had been locked in the shadows that one day they too would be able to speak openly without fear of consequences. This is how the movement for change began. For the destruction of old rules and the creation of a more just and honest industry.